Hey, joining us here on Real Agriculture at CropSphere in Saskatoon, we have author and economist Jeff Rubin. And Jeff, you talked to growers today about how Canada's future, if we look back, Canada used to be known as a breadbasket of the world, and potentially we could return to that type of position.
I think we're going back to that. I think that while climate change has fatal implications for our previous ambitions of becoming an energy superpower based on huge growth of oil sand production, that clearly is not going to happen, but it's going to make other assets or resources in the country more valuable, particularly its fresh water and arable land. I think when you look at what climate change has already done to prairie growing seasons and what it is likely to do in the future, it has the potential to catapult Canada, which has always been 8th, 9th largest world exporter of agricultural produce, into maybe the top 3, because it opens up the possibility of much higher yields and also of growing crops like corn that could never be grown on the prairies before.
And this comes at the same time we're seeing less reliance and less revenue from oil.
Well, oil's been a disaster, and I mean, Alberta now has gone from $1 billion surplus to $6.5 billion deficit. Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, which are also oil-producing provinces, are now looking at big deficits. Oil stocks have lost 60 to 70% of their value. We've shed about 40,000 jobs in the energy sector. The decline in business investment in the oil patch was enough to send the whole economy in a recession through the first half of the year. I think, as Governor Polos from the Bank of Canada recently said, the aftershocks from the collapse in the oil sector is going to be here for another couple of years, and we're going to need offsets, lower interest rates, and I think a significantly lower Canadian dollar.
So do we return to those boom times ever with oil, or is this the end of our
I think the challenge for the oil sands is no longer about expansion. It's about sustaining what they've already got. I'm not sure if 2.3 million barrels a day of oil is sustainable. I think for the oil sands to have an economic future, it's not about digging more oil out of the ground. Rather, it's about doing more with the oil that's already dug out. Virtually all of it is sent to the U.S. for processing. We need to produce less but generate more by turning raw bitumen that trades at the lowest price oil in the world to valuable products like gasoline, motor fuels, and maybe even petrochemicals. So if the Alberta oil sands has an industry in a future, I think it's along a different path of development. Instead of trying to extract more, it's process more of what you're already extracting.
Okay. As for the Canadian dollar, do you see as decoupling of the dollar versus petroleum?
Well, I think the other factor with the Canadian, petroleum will continue to bring the dollar down, but I think the Bank of Canada has made it clear that it's prepared to continue to cut interest rates, even have negative interest rates. The next cut would push Canadian interest rates below U.S. rates. The last time that happened, we had a 62-cent dollar back in 2002. I'm not saying we're going to 62 cents, but we're certainly going in the 60-cent range, and probably within a quarter from now. And that's going to be a huge benefit, not to the oil industry, but it's going to be a huge benefit for the Canadian economy that still relies very heavily on exports to the U.S.
Including agriculture.
Including agriculture, and including a lot of the manufacturing that we lost in central Canada when the oil-driven Canadian dollar went to parity and above.
You mentioned water policy will become critical, maybe as important as oil policy has been in the past.
That's right, because the same climate change that extends growing seasons and opens the door to growing crops like corn, also means water stresses. It means that the spring melt from the glaciers in the eastern Rockies is going to be less and less as those glaciers retreat. And while Canadians have always been worried about international water issues with the U.S., most of the water that flows across the prairies goes out Hudson Bay, the Arctic Ocean. I think the real conflicts are going to be interprovincial issues between Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba about sharing that water, as the need for irrigation and the economic returns to irrigation from growing higher value-added crops makes water all that much more valuable.
So for farmers, for the ag industry, commodity groups, how can they position themselves?
Well, I think in the short run, lower interest rates, a lower exchange rate, lower fuel costs, are all relatively recent good news. I think in the long run, especially with the development of new crops like corn varietals, we could be seeing a boom time in the prairies of the likes of which we haven't seen before. It's not something that's happening every year, but gradually you're seeing more and more corn being cultivated on the prairies. You're seeing prairie farmland basically increase better than any other financial asset in the country. And I think you're going to see agriculture play a much bigger role in the Canadian economy, as oil and a lot of the rest of the resource sector plays a much smaller role.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much.